In Robert Nozick's famous thought experiment, he asks us to imagine having the opportunity to go into an experience machine that will stimulate our brains so as to give us any experience that we would like. You could be the most popular person in school, or you could have loads of money, or be a famous actor or actress. In short, you'd have a much more pleasurable existence inside the machine than you would outside of the machine. Now, Nozick suggests that, nonetheless, you would not plug in. And this is because there are things that matter to us more than just mere pleasurable experiences. So we want our experiences to be in contact with reality, and we want to be a certain person, right? We want to be loving, we want to be kind, or whatever, and not just have the experience of being like this. Since utilitarianism says that the only thing of intrinsic value is pleasure, this argument has been used to suggest that if utilitarianism was true, we should go into the experience machine. But in fact, we wouldn't, suggesting that actually utilitarianism is false. Now, this is the first of two videos on Nozick's experience machine objection. In this one, we'll just look at some preliminary responses to the argument, and then there's a second one. There's a more intricate argument that says why his argument actually fails. So, firstly, Nozick assumes that we would not plug in. He doesn't at all entertain the idea that someone might plug in, but it seems to me that you could have legitimate reasons for plugging in. Imagine if you're really depressed or even on the cusp of suicide. Literally plugging in could save your life. Or what if you're hideously ugly? Imagine you could lead an existence inside the experience machine where instead of being ugly, people find you really attractive, and that would be great. So there are ways that we can make the experience machine more tempting, and it's easy to do that. You just have to think of what's your biggest worry, your biggest concern, your biggest insecurity, and then imagine you could have a life identical to this one, but poof, you don't have that insecurity anymore, it's gone. Or even better, it's the complete opposite. So what if you really lack confidence, right? In the experience machine, you could be one of the most confident people in the world, right? You completely change your life. So I feel like there are ways we can make the experience machine more tempting, and maybe there are legitimate reasons that people would actually plug in. Some writers have suggested that if Nozick is right and our intuition is to not to plug in, this may actually have nothing to do with utilitarianism or pleasure or what we think about what matters to us, but instead it's influenced by a status quo bias. So we tend to have a preference for states that we're already in, right? Something that we're comfortable with, that we know, even if we are offered something better. So one way to think about this comes from Joshua Green. So he says, imagine that right now you're watching this video and then poof, all right, the room goes white. There's this white light. You open up your eyes. You're lying down on a table in a white room, and there's a scientist leering over you in a white coat, and they say, "Hi, I'm just checking in to see, how things are in the experience machine that you've been in for 40 years, and if you want to continue with your experience in the machine." They can press resume at any point, and you'll get back to your simulated life with your in-machine family and friends and everything, all your experiences that you've done where you've been there for 40 years, and you won't even remember this interruption. And of course, you would be like, "What the hell is going on?" But Green suggests that you would be more likely to just continue with life in the machine, right? Because imagine it's the year 2659. I don't know if I said that earlier. So it's 2659. You're told as your eyes open up. Now you wouldn't be like, "What the hell is going on?" You would basically have to start your life from scratch in a life completely foreign to you, with technology you couldn't even imagine, with no one that knows you. You might just be like, "Yeah, you know what? I'll just carry on in the machine." So there is a suggestion here that maybe it really comes down to a status quo bias and nothing to do with pleasure. So now that those preliminary responses are out of the way, let's look at arguments that are a little bit more intricate. What follows largely comes from an article by the philosopher Fred Feldman. Now, the experience machine objection as an argument directly against utilitarianism would look something like this. Interpreted in this way, what Nozick is saying is that if utilitarianism is true, you would plug in. But you wouldn't plug in. Right? And you wouldn't plug in because you want your experience to be in contact with reality, etc., etc. And therefore, utilitarianism is false. But this argument, Feldman says, fails on two accounts. So the first is that utilitarianism is an ethical theory that tells you what you ought to do, not what you would do. Nozick is talking about what you would do or wouldn't do. Secondly, Feldman says that since going into the machine would be leaving your family and friends behind, it's very unlikely that your decision would produce a lot of pleasure or utility overall. Now, remember, utilitarianism is saying that we should maximize pleasure, but that's not just our own pleasure, it's the aggregate pleasure. And if you're going to plug yourself into this machine floating in a tank, you can't help your friends and family that you've left behind. So it seems that plugging in would actually be a decision that would produce relatively low utility. And therefore, utilitarianism would actually tell you not to plug into the machine. However, we could challenge that second argument, because if we look at what Nozick actually says, he says that others could plug in too. It's not just you. So we can imagine everyone goes into their own experience machine and has their own experiences, and no one would be left behind. Literally everyone can live an extremely pleasurable existence in their own experience machines. That actually gets rid of this issue of you leaving people behind and not being able to increase their utility. We're all going in, right? We're all going to increase our utility. And so that seems like a bit of a stronger argument there. It seems that utilitarianism would then say that we should go in. Despite this, the original problem remains, because Nozick is saying that we would not plug in. He's not actually making claims about what we should or shouldn't do. But we can resolve this by using the argument not as a direct attack on utilitarianism, but instead as an attack on ethical hedonism or hedonism. And this forms the basis of utilitarianism, right? So if we can show that ethical hedonism is false, then we can show that indirectly utilitarianism is also false. So ethical hedonism is the idea that the only thing of intrinsic value is pleasure, the only thing of intrinsic disvalue is pain. Another way of putting this, as Feldman does, is to say that the only thing that has direct impact on our welfare are pleasures. Nozick, by saying that certain things matter to us beyond what we can experience in the experience machine, is suggesting that our welfare is made up of more than just pleasurable experiences. But this kind of argument only works against hedonistic forms of utilitarianism, and not against all forms of and not all forms of utilitarianism are hedonistic. So Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, they were hedonists. But preference utilitarianism, for instance, is not committed to hedonism. Preference utilitarianism agrees that we ought to maximize utility, or welfare, but it understands welfare as being composed not of pleasurable experiences, but instead, what increases our welfare is the extent to which our desires or preferences are satisfied. As a result, preference utilitarianism can wiggle out of the experience machine objection, right? It can simply say that what we really want is to have our desire to, say, climb Mount Everest fulfilled. But we don't just want to have the experience of climbing Mount Everest fulfilled, right? That wouldn't fulfill our desire. We want to actually do it. We have the desire to actually do it, not just have the experience of it. So preference utilitarianism can agree with Nozick that you wouldn't plug in. And as a result, preference utilitarianism is entirely unaffected by the objection. But, and we're getting to we're at the end of this video, we're at the end of part 1 now. So in part 2, the question still remains, does Nozick's experience machine objection succeed against hedonistic forms of utilitarianism? And this is quite a long, complicated, intricate argument. So we're going to simplify that, go through it step by step, and we'll see if we think Feldman is right, that Nozick's experience machine objection is just not that good. So thanks for watching, and see you there.